show yourself earlier." She was still gaping at me, so I defended, "And I don't really know about wedding etiquette. I just overheard Alice getting pissed off that someone else had already gotten married at the National Klingon Museum, which is kind of funny because she didn't even want to follow through with that until she found out someone else had." I halted my rambling with a deep breath, concluding, "But, you know, it was precautionary, or whatever." She held up a palm, narrowing her eyes.
"Wedding? Like, as in you and me getting married?"
My chewing came to an abrupt halt, and I suddenly realized why dudes bothered with all the stupid proposal bullshit. "You wouldn't marry me?" I asked turgidly, utterly devastated, but readying myself for what I'd been expecting for months. She quickly shook her head, correcting.
"No. I just didn't realize that you'd even thought about it."
I scoffed. Why wouldn't I think about it? It wasn't like wedding shit hadn't been pounded into my head for the last year. The real question was, how could I think of anything else? She hedged.
"You've been distracted."
"I mean, it's a given," I argued, though inwardly, I felt shitty for ever making her believe that I was so distracted by being miserable that I hadn't ever considered our future together. Then I whispered, "Right?" and risked meeting her gaze.
"I guess,"
she decided, finally resting back into her position at my side. As if sensing my troubled expression, she hastily amended,
"I mean, yes. It's a given for me, definitely."
"Oh," I breathed, really fucking relieved as I pulled her against me. "Cool. June. Take a right here," I directed from the passenger seat, my swayskin sticking uncomfortably to the leather upholstery. Bella took a right and then left and then another left, and then she turned around, because that last left had been a fuck-up, and then she took a right, and then we were pulling into the little hilltop cemetery, where my dad had been buried. I straightened in my seat as we neared his plot, idly noting how nothing had changed since I'd visited Chicago during that one fucked-up summer 3.5 years prior. There was still that same funky-looking tree on the south end, that looked like any totally cliché cemetery tree. There wasn't much shade offered when we arrived, and the Chicago heat was fucking sweltering this year. I wiped my brow as we traveled to the trunk of our car, lifting the hatch and extracting the exorbitant bundles of flowers we'd purchased. My gravesite competitiveness hadn't lessened any. I sort of stood by the car for a moment, watching the toes of my boots kick around the gravel while Bella put up one of those ugly fucking sun visors in the windshield.
"But it's like the only time we'll ever get to use one,"
she'd said upon buying it at the rest stop in Wyoming. It had motherfucking puppies on it.
"You ready?"
she asked, looking a little uncertain as she squinted against the sun.
"I can't stay here."
I rolled my eyes, figuring, you were half the reason we came to begin with. "Let's just do it," I concluded, clearing my throat and weaving around gravestones as she followed. His grave was unkempt, and it elicited a deep pang that made my chest ache. Bella looked on as I cleared away the weeds that had grown over the distressed etchings of a few cherished words. My dad seemed like a dream to me now. Like I'd closed my eyes the first 8 years of my life and conjured up this idyllic human being. I'm sure he wasn't really perfect. He'd probably been flawed in some way. Maybe he'd always left his towels on the floor, or had never given to charity, or had talked in movie theaters, or something. I'd never fucking know. To me, the concept of him had turned abstract and distant, and in that distance he existed, as a model of perfection in my mind, which was okay. I could only hope to be remembered like that once my sorry ass was gone.
"Hello, Mr. Mason,"
Bella greeted, hands clasped respectfully at her front. Her face was so stoic and serious as she regarded him that I had to hide a grin. I idly recalled my last visit, and how talking to a chunk of stone had felt awkward and ridiculous. Bella didn't have that issue at all. In fact, when we visited her mother's grave in Phoenix a few months ago, I'd been convinced we should have simply taken a tent. Renee's cemetery was nicer, but more crowded. Not that Bella cared one bit that groups of people were tossing her strange looks as she lounged against her mom's upright headstone. She talked and talked and talked and wondered aloud where the fuck my manners were when I didn't introduce myself. God, we were so fucked up that it wasn't even tragic anymore.
"My name is Bella,"
she continued, appearing a little nervous as she wrung her fingers.
Me and your son have been seeing each other for a while now. You might like to know that he's a perfect gentleman, well, with the exception of his language, but I've done the best I can, and you know, like I keep telling Esme, that my aunt, they're just words. No big deal.
She tucked her hair behind her ear, and darted her eyes to me, mouthing in blatant annoyance.
Say hello.
Jesus. Hi, I said, preferring to simply stand, and spend a few pensive moments paying my respects. Not all of us could be as unabashedly Lenny as my girl. Shrugging, she grasped a lock of her hair, and twirled it around her forefinger, rambling.
We live in Seattle right now. The weather there is a little cooler. Anyway, we have an apartment, but don't worry. Most sophomores live in campus housing. Or one of those totally gross studio apartments, but Carlisle, he's Edward's adoptive father, he spoils us, and makes us live in buildings with security, so...
She paused here, and looked to me like I might take over, but hell. I waved her on. She happily obliged.
School is going good, too. You should see some of Edward's grades. He's really smart. And talented. Like, freakishly talented. He can't sketch anything by memory. It's borderline disturbing. He's going to make a great doctor, too, which almost seems unfair. I'm just majoring in business, and hoping to run my own one day. That won't change lives or anything, but Edward will. I know it. He changed mine.
She gnawed thoughtfully at her lip before concluding in a breath.
I can't wait to meet your wife.
My body stiffened, and I fixed my eyes to the creepy tree over the hill, swallowing rapidly.
Edward,
Bella worried, grasping my hand in hers. I'm fine, I responded, but I didn't want to see it. Seeing it made it real, and making it real made me physically ill, more often than not, even though a whole year had passed. She entwined her arm through mine and did a semi-turn, beginning in a small voice.
Hello, Mrs. Mason. I'm Bella Swan. It's a real pleasure to meet you. Edward's told me so much, mostly the good stuff. I've seen drawings of you and Mr. Mason, and Edward looks so much like you.
A brief gust of wind swept through the area, and cooled my face, easing me slightly. She continued in a softer voice.
He has some things he'd like to say.
I finally glimpsed at the large square beside my dad's headstone, and my breath caught as I stared down at it. It was so fucking plain, almost generic. My stomach lurched and I battled not to heap, rubbing the sweat from the back of my neck. Bella sighed an apology to me, rubbing her palm up and down my back, but I could handle this shit. I cleared my throat and shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, briefly wishing I had asked Bella to stay behind. I began, I'm really sorry for leaving you here to rot. At this, Bella sucked in a sharp breath, and dug her fingernails into my arm.
Edward,
she warned. I know, I grumbled, but refused to take it back. Anyway, I just wanted to visit and say I was sorry, and ask for your forgiveness and shit, which you'd probably give me, even though I don't deserve it.
I'm seriously about to go back to the car.
Bella disrupted, shaking her head.
I can't hear you talk about yourself like this.
She met my gaze with a beseeching stare. Yep, sorry. Old habits. I smiled ruefully, but I didn't take that back, either. I looked back to the gravestones, finishing, and I also wanted you to meet my girl.
And?
Bella coaxed. I hedged, and leave some flowers and shit. Her glare was evident without me even needing to look at her. With a huff, I admitted aloud, and I wanted to tell you that by not living my life to the fullest, I was disrespecting your memory, and I promise not to do that again. I looked to Bella with raised brows. Okay? She reluctantly nodded, but pulled me to the ground, where we sat, picking at the grass. A silence settled between the four of us that ended up being less uncomfortable than expected. The breeze was picking up and cooling us down, and my girl's hair looked so fucking beautiful and cereal blowing in the sunlight that it distracted me. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and crossed her ankles, stating,
"Thanks for letting me meet them."
Her expression was peaceful and relieved, and upon hearing it, I felt my own reprieve. "Thanks for talking me into it," I offered, because seeing my mother's final resting place hadn't broken me, after all. Yep, it was painful, and fucked up, but that was something I would have felt regardless of circumstance. We stayed until the sun finally began to set, cooling the air, and pinkening the sky. My girl would utter random comments that would make me smile, or laugh, or nod at the headstones with a serious face. And though, outwardly, I was holding these fucking absurd and casual conversations with two chunks of granite, inwardly, I was having a very different conversation with the two people they represented. I think Bella probably knew this, because when it grew quiet, she didn't disrupt me, instead opting to intertwine her fingers with mine. I told them I was happy, and I was going to try my damnedest to be happier, because I had a beautiful girl and a family that loved me, and it took me a while to get it, but I finally understood that none of it was my fucking fault. It was ironic how, after everything, my eventual conclusion could be summed up in a simple, shrugged murmuring of shit happens. When we left, the air between us held that last hint of resolution I needed. It had all began with a falling tree, and ended in the little hilltop cemetery, where my mother, my father, and my addiction to guilt were all now buried. You should save it, I advised of the sun visor as I ducked into the car. At Bella's curved brow, eyes all shining, and fucking beautiful, I elaborated, we might come back again, someday. The motherfucking